If you've never heard of Morgellons disease, you're lucky. Unfortunately, that luck is about to run out. Officially, Morgellons, discovered in 2001, is just a form of delusional parasitosis, which is a fancy term for thinking you're infested with parasites. Unofficially, it's more than that. Victims of Morgellons will tell you that their skin, as well as their sores, hives, welts, hair follicles, and sometimes pores, are full of alien fibers. The internet is full of images depicting Morgellons fibers. Even so, the medical community will tell you that Morgellons is nothing but a mental illness. That's because they never met my mother. She was a teenage bride of a doomed electrician who fried himself to death before I was born. He left her a jobless widow with a toddler and a baby on the way. She moved in with her parents. It was miserable. My grandfather couldn't stand her, and my grandmother regarded her with what I can only describe as benevolent contempt. My Uncle James, who was only 17 years old, needled her and teased my sister Claire constantly. My mom made the best of a bad situation. My earliest memories are cuddling with her and Claire in a blanket fort, reading Franklin's Halloween and Miss Susie by flashlight. My second memory is sitting in the same blanket fort the day my grandma died, watching wriggling blue strings erupt from Mom's skin. "Claire!" she screamed. "Claire, help me!" Claire pinched one of the wriggling strings between her fingers and pulled. It came out like the longest of ingrown hairs, gleaming wetly in the light. She saw me watching and yelled, "Get out!" I crawled out of the fort and cried myself to sleep as Mom alternatively pulled blue threads out of her arms and scratched her skin off. I woke to the sound of my grandfather's pained voice. "You know what this means." "Don't start!" Mom shouted. "Don't! My mother just died!" I shifted. Claire set a warning hand on my shoulder and squeezed. "My wife just died," was the quiet response. "And now, her insanity is going to come through you. You know it." "But it isn't my fault." "It doesn't matter," Grandpa said gently. "I have a son to protect." "What about me? What about your grandchildren?" She began to cry. There came the sound of a scuffle. My mother cried out as my grandpa snarled, "I don't know, but I can't have this." I opened my eyes a crack. Grandpa squeezed Mom's arm. Even from the distance, I could see the injuries. Cruel welts, bleeding scratches, weeping sores. "Chloe," Mom whimpered. "Shut up!" Mom screamed. A sharp crack rang out. Mom reeled back. My mouth fell open. He'd hit her. My grandfather had hit my mother. "It's your fault," my mother whispered. "And hers." My grandfather didn't answer. After a while, Mom wiped her face. "What do I do when I find them?" "Whatever you want," my grandpa said. "As long as they aren't mine or my son's. Now leave." His voice broke. "Please." "I have nowhere to go." My mom's voice was so shrill and broken that it terrified me. "You're a mother," my grandfather said. "You'll figure it out." After 2 weeks in a woman's shelter, my mother found a waitressing job. Within a short amount of time, she found 2 more part-time jobs, and a few weeks later, we moved into a 1-bedroom apartment with mineral-crusted faucets and water-stained walls. She took a 4th job to maintain this rock star lifestyle. Claire started school soon after, and at the ripe old age of 4, I became a latchkey kid. I subsisted on chicken and a biscuit, crackers, and public access TV. Sometimes I leafed through our meager stash of picture books, but doing so recalled the blanket fort days. The memories were painful by that time, so I didn't look at the books often. My mother had no time for me. She came home every night and locked herself in her bathroom, sometimes alone, sometimes with Claire. Soon after, the sound of scratching always filled the apartment. Rough, painful, endless. She'd finally emerge hours later, arms wrapped in blood-stained toilet paper, and settle herself on the couch. Sometimes she'd had metallic strings in her hands. Blue or red or green, yellow or purple. Mostly, though, she left them under the bathroom cabinet. I spent so many solitary hours studying these ropes, running them between my fingers and frowning. What were they? Why did they come out of my mom? And the most frightening question of all, would they one day come out of me? One evening, my mother came home in the best mood I'd ever seen. A grocery bag hung from her shoulder. "Guess what?" "What?" Claire asked. She looked tired, and no wonder. I can only imagine what it's like to be 8 years old and your mother's caretaker. Mom danced over and emptied the bag on the couch. DVDs, popcorn, candy? I cheered as she proclaimed, "It's movie night!" We changed into our pajamas, watched 4 movies, and gorged on junk food. It was bliss, one of my only golden memories. I was settled between them, on the cusp of sleep and brimming with happiness, when Mom screamed. I jerked to attention, heart threatening to explode from my chest. "Get away! Both of you!" Mom shot up. The blankets tangled around her feet. She tripped and skidded forward, the friction of the floorboards dragging her nightgown up over her hips. Right then, my heart broke for her. I clambered to my feet and approached her with the same caution one might use when approaching a downed elephant. The flashlight lay on the floor several feet away, throwing her legs into sharp relief. There was something wrong with her feet. Terrible, overwhelming fear curdled in my belly. "Claire," I whimpered. The skin was moving, roiling like long grass in the wind. Tiny lumps threw odd shadows across the floor and quivered. "Don't look," Claire said. "It's okay." But it clearly wasn't okay. The lumps on my mother's feet split and grew, creating a network of hideous sores that continued to roil and pop like something inside was struggling to escape. Images of hairy spiders and shiny centipedes filled my head. Then I saw them. Tiny, thread-like legs, the color of gold, emerging from the sores. Claire went to my mother, but Mom shoved her away. "Don't touch them! Don't you see the color?" They grew from my mother's wounds, waving languidly until they touched the floor. Then they began to crawl. 3 legs, then 6, then a dozen, sprouting from her sores like bizarre flowers. I kept expecting the bodies to follow, and what awful bodies they would be, attached to these terribly long, unnatural legs. But bodies never came. Just legs. Legs like golden thread. Legs like silver thread. Legs like ruby thread. Legs like black thread, erupting from my mother's skin and piling on the floor. Something compelled me just then. I don't know what it was, even now. But I swallowed my fear and marched to my mother's side. "No!" she screamed. "Claire!" Claire tried to grab me, but I shoved her away. Then I grabbed the pile of golden threads, slippery, fine, and strangely jointed, and began to braid the strands. They glimmered in the flashlight like precious metal. When I reached the end, I pinched the threads between my fingers and pulled. Finally, with a small twinkly sort of pop, they came free. I tied off the braid and examined my work, overwhelmed with wonder. The braid was alive. I watched, entranced, as it expanded and deflated. With a furious cry, my mother snatched the braid off the floor. "Don't ever do that again!" She hobbled to the bathroom, whimpering as her injured feet brushed against the rug. Claire went after her. I tried to follow, but she whirled around and shoved me away. I fell into the coffee table and clipped my head on the corner. I watched, stunned, as Claire ushered my mother inside and slammed the door. Pain set in, swiftly overtaking the shock, and I cried. No one came to check on me. The next morning, they left. Claire for school, Mom for work, without so much as a goodbye. I stewed in my own misery for hours. Around lunchtime, I went to the bathroom and opened the cabinet. Sure enough, sitting like a crown jewel atop the pile of strings and fibers was the gleaming golden braid. My reverence was short-lived. The sight of it, a potent reminder of my misery and loneliness, incited bitter anger. I quickly found a pair of scissors and cut the braid into pieces. Cruel satisfaction swelled each time a bright, beautiful strand hit the floor. Claire didn't come back from school that day. I didn't even care. I imagined her and my mother traipsing around town, eating ice cream and seeing movies. That was the kind of thing you did with your favorite child, wasn't it? My mother finally came home at 10. She walked in, moaning and whimpering. I didn't even acknowledge her. She didn't acknowledge me either. She simply trudged into the bathroom. After a moment, she screamed, "What have you done?" She bolted out of the bathroom and ran at me. I cringed, expecting her to strike me. Instead, she fell to her knees and threw the cut-up braids at me. "You killed her! Do you know what you've done? You killed your sister!" She screamed and raged at me. I stared, paralyzed like a snake before a charmer. After a while, she dragged herself back to the bathroom. She didn't speak to me until the following Saturday, when she woke me early. "Get dressed." She thrust a second-hand black dress at me. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Claire's funeral," she said curtly. I'll never forget the way my sister looked, nestled in her casket like a wax doll. The altar before her was covered in framed photos of her. Claire and me, Claire and my mother, Claire with friends, and Claire and our grandmother. When I saw that particular photo, I froze. Grandma's arms were full of scars, faded ropes like snakes, cruel divots like someone had scooped her flesh away, dozens of white marks peppering her from shoulder to wrist. That night, I dreamed of Claire writhing in her coffin as fiber exploded from her eyes. Over the next few years, my mom's health, physical and mental, deteriorated. Her arms were perpetually infected. After a while, they began to smell. She lost one job after another. We rarely left the apartment, but when we did, there'd inevitably be another warning or notice tacked to the front door. On a January night, the power went out. One minute, I was munching crackers while the TV blared. The next, everything was dark. I cringed, expecting to see my mom panic. Instead, she said, "Let's build a blanket fort." She found candles and a flashlight. A fort building commenced. It was freezing cold that night, but in my memory, it was warm and comfortable, and the room was golden. We settled in with Miss Susie and Franklin's Halloween. I snuggled up against my mother. Her voice lulled me into the warm limbo between slumber and wakefulness. Illustrations swam before my eyes and bled slowly into dreams. The next morning, I woke up alone. I sat up, sleepy and confused. For just an instant, I saw something wriggling into my arm, a golden thread slipping into my skin like a worm through the earth. Panic swept over me. "Mom?" I screamed. "Mom!" I searched the bedroom, living room, the kitchen. Nothing. Then I tried the bathroom door. It was locked. I waited outside for a very long time. After many hours, I gathered the courage to fetch my neighbor, who called 911. The social worker didn't mince words. "Your mother was ill. She ended her own life." "No! They killed her!" I launched into a hysterical description of the strings in her skin. "Look!" I rolled my sleeve up, revealing the golden thread under my skin. "I have them too!" Suffice to say, my life was hell for a few years. Mental illness, psychosis, parasitosis. One nurse even heard the word Morgellons spoken hesitantly like a dirty word. It was awful. I came through it okay, if you don't count the nightmares or the choking panic I felt whenever I saw a loose thread on my skin. I told myself to forget it all. As I got older, I succeeded. By the time I graduated college, I forgot it all. Until 3 months ago. I'd settled in on the sofa after a long day. My boyfriend was in the kitchen boiling water for tea. I was pleasantly exhausted. I leaned back and stretched. On my arms was a scratch, and growing through it, like a sprout through concrete, I saw gleaming golden fiber. I sat up and pinched it between my fingertips. It pulsed under my skin, warm and slick. I pulled. It came out painfully, unraveling like something from a nightmare. There it was, clear as day, a glistening thread growing out of my skin. My boyfriend came into the room. "Hey, babe?" I spun around, mind struggling to formulate an explanation, but I turned too sharply, too carelessly, and the fiber snapped. The last inch retracted into my skin with a sting. The rest hung from my fingertips, drifting dreamily. And, with the floor shaking, heartbreaking thud, my boyfriend collapsed. He was gone before he hit the floor. A stroke, the hospital said. My world shattered. And things got worse. Exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after my boyfriend died, I found another thread. It snaked just below the skin. Fully visible, but just out of reach. Rich, shining russet. I went to the doctor. "Looks like an ingrown hair," she said. "Can you cut it out?" "There's not really any need." "It hurts," I lied. "And itches like hell." She did as I asked. When she removed it, she pulled too hard and it snapped in two. I went into work the next morning and immediately knew something was wrong. The somber atmosphere clung to everything like a wet blanket. Even my friend Selena, no nonsense, tough as nails Selena, was crying. "What's wrong?" I asked. She wiped her eyes. "Marcus." Marcus was our boss, and one of my best friends outside of work. He died the previous afternoon, right in the middle of my doctor appointment. 4 days later, I found a silver fiber poking through my skin. I pulled, the tip broke off. I used a sewing needle to remove the rest. The next day, my neighbor told me that the landlord's new baby had died. Everything finally clicked into place. I called in sick and lay in bed weeping. The threads and fibers grew and poked and snaked under my skin. It was all I could do not to scratch the way my mother had, because if I scratched, threads would break. If I pulled, they would snap. And somehow, some way, people would die. I was stuck. I couldn't pull them out, couldn't go to the doctor, couldn't do anything. I couldn't kill people, but I couldn't live that way either. To cut a long story short, I tried to kill myself. But Selena, afraid I would be fired and determined to help me, found me in time. Even so, she was almost too late. My heart stopped. I needed resuscitation, and afterward, I spent 2 weeks drifting in and out of consciousness. When I finally surfaced, the first thing I did was check my arms. I couldn't believe it. No welts, no scratches, no bumps, no fibers or threads. Just clear, clean skin. I improved exponentially after that. It was a delusion, I decided, brought on by trauma, like before. I'm better now. I believed that, I really did. Then Selena came to visit me in the hospital. I immediately choked up. How do you talk to the person who saved you from yourself? Luckily, she made it easy. We spoke for over an hour. Then suddenly she scratched her arm and yelped. What? I asked. I don't know, maybe a splinter? She held her arm out. On her wrist was a pale welt, and sprouting from the welt, a delicate golden fiber. I didn't say anything. Why would I? Even if she believed me, she'd want answers. I don't have any. I'm just glad it isn't me anymore.